Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to one of my regular updates from our capital. We are approaching the end of the year and all of the mad rush that's going on here at the Capitol. Kind of a crazy way to run the enterprise in terms of loading everything up at the end of the year, but that seems to be the way we do it. I got three items that I want to go through briefly and then be happy to take your questions. The first is really good news for Virginia. Commerce Department announced this morning a tentative agreement, $725 million to Micron, where there already exists a major semiconductor manufacturing facility in Manassas that will bring some of the most advanced memory chip technology in the world to the facility in Manassas. This is important for a variety of reasons. You know, I've been talking about semiconductor chips since 2020. Why is that important to Virginians? Because any device that you've got that's electronic, that has an on and off switch on it, chances are it's got semiconductor chips in it. And while the United States dominated and invented semiconductor chips and as far back in the 80s and into the 90s and early 2000s, we literally had more than a third of the manufacturing capability in America. Unfortunately, we've allowed that to move afar. China is growing rapidly. The most advanced chips are all made in Taiwan. The most advanced chips for our national security, for our ships and planes, the most advanced computing chips are made in Taiwan. And with the China's PRC's efforts to try to potentially encircle Taiwan, that puts us at a great vulnerability. We passed a few years back the CHIPS bill, which I was proud to be the co-author of with John Cornyn from Texas. We committed $52 billion as well as other incentives to bring that manufacturing capacity back to America. Important for national security, important for job creation. Micron, one of the leading memory chip makers in the world, with this investment from the Commerce Department, and I've been working closely with the governor on this and Virginia Department of Economic, VEDP. We've worked hand in glove, and Virginia's putting incentives. Now the federal government's putting incentives, and Micron is bringing some of the most advanced technology in the world that's literally already in operation in Taiwan into our facility in Virginia. It's a great win for Virginia. It'll provide 400 plus high-skilled manufacturing jobs. It will also allow us to better grow our footprint for the semiconductor supply chain, not only in Northern Virginia, but hopefully, again, around the whole Commonwealth. We've got a number of other good sites. We're pursuing a few other deals, but this was great news. As I saw some of these other sites being announced around the country, again, our congressional delegation, Tim Kaine and I, working with Governor Youngkin, we really put our shoulder to the wheel to make sure that we were going to be successful. And it's good news for our country and great news for the Commonwealth. On another subject that's obviously, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I'm getting lots of information on, and that is the situation in Syria. Bashar Assad, the brutal dictator in Syria, in the 14-year civil war, literally killed more than 500,000 Syrian people. Brutal beyond belief, using chemical weapons, barrel bombs. His regime was supported by both Iran and Russia, two of our greatest adversaries. The civil war in Syria literally drove 14 million Syrians to leave the country. That puts enormous burdens on other nations in the Middle East. That has led to mass refugee movements towards Europe and even some here to America. Seeing a new chance for a new beginning in Syria is a great opportunity. But there's also, again, a challenge because the rebel forces were previously called al-Nusra, which was affiliated with al-Qaeda. Now they are trying to represent themselves now as reformed, but we're going to have to watch this very carefully because Syria is made up of not all Sunni Muslims. They have Alawites, they have Christians, they have Druze. Protection of minorities, protections of women's rights are critical. And Syria, in many ways, is the key to the Middle East. There are We have, working with Kurdish allies, have a number of ISIS prisoners located in Syria, guarded by Kurds, but we have 900 of our troops there. We've got to make sure those terrorists are not released. Clearly, the fall of the Assad regime happened much quicker than anticipated because Israel had been able to denigrate and basically destroy a lot of the leadership of Hezbollah and take out a lot of their missile capacity. That's all good news. Israel also, with our support and others in the region, were able to take out some of the Iranian defense systems, which has exposed the vulnerability of Iran. And our assistance there was when we helped Israel take down the Iranian efforts to bomb Israel. This is going to be a volatile time. The good news is, if we can end the conflict in Gaza, I think there could be a complete realignment with Iran and terrorist organizations going down, and nations like Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis turning more to us, and with the potential of Saudi Arabia actually recognizing Israel and potentially leading to a complete realignment that would be good for peace in the region. But playing this out and getting it right over the next few months are going to be critical, and critical to our national security and to our intelligence community. So I'm hopeful, but very much believe this new Syrian rebel group, we have to watch its activities very closely. And then finally, and this is one of my top priorities in these last couple of weeks, we've got to obviously make sure we fund the government. We've got to get the defense bill and the intelligence bill passed, but we also have to get the disaster relief passed for those states that were particularly hurt by the Hurricane Helene. We in Southwest Virginia took a big hit, not as bad as North Carolina, but we have businesses that literally have been approved for SBA loans that if we don't refill the bucket of the Small Business Administration money, those loans won't go out. And that's just cruel to the businesses who've, through no fault of their own, have been hit by Mother Nature. And, this is why they pay taxes. You get FEMA relief, SBA relief in the event of a disaster is not charity. It's part of our obligation to each other. So that is a high priority for me. And I know Tim and Tom Tillis, the North Carolina senator who's been taking the lead on North Carolina standpoint, we got to get that done. Lots of other things going on. I won't go through the normal rant and rave about the continuing resolution and the craziness of going through this same movie every time. I think you know my feelings on that. But the expectation is that that will move fairly smoothly through the House, and we'll get it next week. And federal workers, contractors, and others won't have to go through a shutdown. Although I should quickly add that even when you get close to a shutdown, the amount of money we spend, for example, with our air traffic controllers having to go through shutdown procedures is a waste of money, an extra burden on the workforce, and just plain crazy. But this should have been resolved literally months ago. And it was much more a case, not so much Democrat-Republican, but the Senate had one position and the House Republicans had another position. But maybe with the new Senate majority, if they can speed the process up, I will be supportive of that being sped up. But with that, why don't I turn it back over to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you again for joining us. And I just wanted to ask you a question related to the nomination process. I understand that you're going to meet with John Ratcliffe, the nominee for CIA, tomorrow. And also, do you plan to meet with Tulsi Gabbard? And given what you just said about Syria, do you have concerns about her past comments and past meetings with the ousted president of Syria, as well as some comments related to Russia?
Well, I'm going to meet with all the president's nominees that president-elect nominees. I did that in the past. I'm going to do it in an orderly process. Mr. Ratcliffe, who I worked with during the first Trump administration, he was nominated first. I'm sure I'll see Ms. Gabbard at some point. But, and I've said before, I've got questions. Bashar Assad was a brutal dictator that murdered 500,000 Syrian people, led to the greatest refugee migration out of the Middle East. in decades was propped up by a brutal Iranian regime, by a Hezbollah terrorist group coming out of Lebanon, and by Russia. I've got questions about that and comments made. I also have questions because the whole nature of the intelligence community, we have got the best in the world, but the amount of information that we get from our partners around the world, you think about Israel's Mossad or the MI5 and 6 in the UK, they only share that information with us on a voluntary basis. We can't demand intelligence from, from our partners. That's a total relationship based on trust. And, there have been reports, and I'll ask about Ms. Gabbard's comments about folks like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange who leaked classified information. I think that undermines our national security. And if our allies don't have confidence that the intelligence they share will be kept secret, they won't share it. And that will make America less strong.
Senator, our next question is Tom Fitzgerald with Fox 5.
Senator, thanks for doing the call. Earlier today over in the House, D.C. Mayor Bowser was having an appropriations hearing on the district budget. We're 10 days now from the end of the session. I was wondering if you could give us any insight into the Senate about the RFK Stadium bill. Have you heard anything?
Well, I don't think, I know Virginia was in some earlier conversations. I don't think that's as alive at this point. I know there was a negotiation, Tom, going back and forth between the Maryland senators and the district and the commanders' ownership. It's great the commanders are doing better. I do think it would be great if they had a permanent home in the region. And if it's not going to be in Virginia, there's obviously a lot of history around RFK. But I think we work well with Maryland on a lot of issues. There are certain things like the FBI we have disagreements on. But I think those discussions between Maryland and the district are ongoing. But I don't have a report as of 12:45 on, I guess it's Tuesday.
Senator, our next question is Trevor Baratko with Inside Nova.
Okay.
Hi, Senator. Related to this morning's Micron announcement, we heard a lot of kind of preliminary deal and tentative agreement. Can you just lay out what makes that, what kind of etches it in stone and a timeline for that for when Micron receives the federal funds?
Well, there was, as you're aware, there was the announcement of the kind of letter of intent stage for the Micron Manassas facility. There was also announcement of a firm deal, I believe, on New York and Idaho. Those, actually, the Micron facility, because there's not as much construction, will be up and operating long before those other facilities are up, and it'll be up and operating with the most advanced technology in the memory field. That's good in and of itself, but it also guarantees the future of the Micron facility. As we know, we've got semiconductor facilities around the state that didn't stay up with current technology that are sitting vacant now. We don't want that to happen. We actually want to build on our semiconductor footprint. And what happens is you go from this kind of letter of intent stage or agreement to a full contractual stage. And I've talked to both the CHIPS office and I've talked to the Micron leadership, who obviously has got a long history in Virginia, that we need to move that as quickly as possible. I can't imagine, based upon the national security standpoint, based upon the American jobs that are being created, based upon the innovation as we think about AI and the critical nature of chips, both GPU chips and CPU chips, to making sure we maintain our leadership in the semiconductor field, that the new administration would cut back on that. It would be a brutally bad business decision. But I do think we all feel like the faster we can move this along, the better. And I'm going to keep the pressure on both Micron and our friends at the Commerce Department to go ahead and, they've already done a couple deals with Micron. The ability to get the final contract in place should be done, I hope, as quickly as possible. But I feel very confident that this will get done, and this technology will, most advanced in the world, literally being taken from Taiwan, will move into the Manassas facility.
Moving on to Jad Khalil with Virginia Public Media.
Hey, Senator, thanks for taking our questions. I just had some questions on Syria. How surprised were you and other Senate Intel members by the surprise offensive, and do you support changing the designation of HTS as a terrorist organization?
Well, I think we were all surprised. We knew that the rebel groups who were in kind of the northwest of Syria, they'd had control of about 15-20%, I believe, of the whole overall population, much smaller part of the landmass of Syria. We knew they were had been pretty well equipped. I mean, Turkey, I think, was aware, and this, I think, would not have taken place if Hezbollah had not been their effectiveness taken out, and if Iran had not had the beatback that the Israelis did in terms of taking out a lot of their air defense systems. But the awareness of the timing or how quickly the Assad army would crumble, it frankly brought back memories of what happened to the Afghan military when the Taliban took over. Not a very good image from an American standpoint. But in terms of undesignating, like President Biden said, I'm open to that. But that's got to be based upon the performance of this group. I mean, there are a whole host of rebel groups in Syria. HTS has tried to redefine itself. I've seen some of the interviews with their leader, who is saying the right things. But this is not a case where words alone. It will be actions. I'm glad to see so far that there doesn't seem to be, plundering of private businesses. They've asked the government bureaucrats to stay on to keep Syria functioning, but trying to keep some of the hardcore Islamist terrorist groups that still exist in Syria at bay, and actually trying to move, hopefully, towards a less authoritarian, I'm not saying full democratic, but less authoritarian regime, different than the Assad regime, would be a step in the right direction. But I don't think it would be smart of an administration to de-designate before we see a little bit more of their activities.
Senator, our next question is Kelsey Childress with WSUT.
Hey, Senator, thanks for doing this. Now, you mentioned that Syria is the key to the Middle East. So how do you think what's happening in Syria will impact other wars overseas like Russia and Ukraine or Israel and Gaza?
Well, again, one of the reasons that we have seen Russia not be able to come to the assistance of the Assad regime, and Assad is now in Moscow, tail between his legs, taking political haven there. And I'm not sure, other than North Korea and Russia, I'm not sure there were many other countries around the world that would take him. Again, 500,000 of his own people killed. And you see the outpouring of jubilation from Syrians across all sects in Syria. So Russia is clearly on its back foot. The Russian losses on a monthly basis, yes, they're eroding away at some of the Ukrainian defenses in the east, but they are losing many more troops. They don't have an unlimited supply of men and armaments. And I think it would, again, I know President-elect Trump says he wants to bring about a settlement. I think I think we'd all welcome a settlement of the Ukraine war, but not one where Putin dictates the terms. Not one where, for all the flaws of the democracy in Ukraine, a non-authoritarian regime gets taken over by an authoritarian regime. Not a settlement that would have Russia then say, okay, it took us a while, but we took out Ukraine, and now we're going to look at Poland or the Baltic states that are NATO members. So, we'll see what happens in the coming months in terms of Ukraine. I do think it's important that we continue to equip them, our NATO allies as well. They have stepped up. And we'd all like to see a settlement, but on fair terms, not terms dictated by Vladimir Putin. In terms of the situation in Gaza. I'm glad to see that we've got a ceasefire in Lebanon. I think, let me deal with that first, and I think that was, in a way, what touched off the rebels taking out Assad. I think that we need to get to a ceasefire in Syria. I'm sorry, in Gaza. I think the hostages need to be released. I think it's still heartbreaking, and that former Virginia resident Hersh Goldberg Poland was murdered by the terrorist who was one of the hostages. Heartbreaking story. But you can't eliminate the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. And there is such an opportunity right now for a realignment in that region from, frankly, the keeper of the faith, Saudi Arabia, of the Muslim faith. If we could get to a point where the Saudis would recognize Israel and build upon the Abraham Accords that started under President Trump, you could have this region totally shift. I mean, it was one of the reasons I was so happy for the settlement in truce, at least in Lebanon. I won't go down this rabbit hole and go on for long, but Lebanon is one of the most diverse countries in the region. It's got Sunni, Shia, Christian, Druze. It is a very complicated country, and the Lebanese people across their faith bases were sick to death of Hezbollah and its heavy-handed tactics. They were ready for them to go. But when Israel, the bombing went beyond Hezbollah and villages were being hit, you suddenly had a sympathy alignment between all of these groups that were tired of Hezbollah actually starting to support them. And bringing about a ceasefire there was in Israel's best interest. Bringing about a ceasefire in Gaza so that this potential remaking of the region is in Israel's best interest as well.
Senator, our next question is Bill Atkinson with the Petersburg Progress Index.
Senator, always good to be with you. My question is, last week, Representative Jen McClellan sent a letter to the House Appropriations leadership asking for extension of the authority to reimburse stolen SNAP benefits. In that letter, she noted how Virginia has been severely affected, with stolen activity in the Richmond area hovering around 2,000% higher last month than the previous month. My question to you is, what are your thoughts on the issue of stolen SNAP benefits and how Congress can help? And is there anything you or Senator King can do on your side of the Capitol to help push this McClellan request along when it comes in the Senate?
Listen, Jen McClellan is an extraordinarily talented congresswoman, and I'm going to follow her lead on this. But to think about, SNAP benefits, food stamps, they go to the most at-risk Americans, and when those are stolen or misappropriated or misused, you're literally taking food out of hungry folks' mouths. And unfortunately, in Virginia and in America, food insecurity is a much bigger problem than most Virginians recognize. And the level of food deserts in terms of access to healthy food is really undermined. So I know Tim and I will be together in literally at a meeting when I'm done here, and I know we're going to visit on this subject. But anything we can do to help those individuals who's been victims of stolen SNAP benefits, I want to count me in.
Senator, our final question is John Fredericks.
Hey, John.
Hey, Senator, thanks for having me on and taking this question. Look, I'm just on my way back from the Middle East. I was a week there when all this happened. I went to a press conference in Doha. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who, of course, they backed Assad, said that Russia would not under any circumstances leave their warm port naval bases there. He accused the U.S. of tacitly supporting terrorists, pointing out that the leader of HTS, as one of my colleagues brought up earlier, is not only on our terror watch list, but they have a U.S. have a $10 million bounty on its head. What is your position on President Trump's CENTCOM staff bombing, straight bombing of one of the rebel factions the other day? And where do we go from here? Why did they do the bombing? And where do we go from here?
Yeah, John, as you know, and I didn't know you'd been in the region. I'm glad you're going back. Lavrov has been, the longest-serving foreign minister, actually in the whole world at this point. He is basically parrots the Moscow position and Putin's position. The idea that somehow we were behind this, when I said earlier we didn't even know the rebel group was going to launch this level of attack, and we sure as heck didn't know that the Russians were going to cut and run and the Iranians cut and run as the Assad army fell apart. But as you said, there are other groups. There are ISIS-related groups. As you know, there are also ISIS prisoners that are some of the worst of the worst that our Kurdish allies are keeping imprisoned that are in eastern Syria. So the idea that you've got this mix of terrorist groups, and clearly HTS, they were called al-Nusra earlier, aligned with al-Qaeda. If they're transitioned to a non-terrorist organization, how they treat the people in Syria, whether they are willing to adhere to rule of law. You don't get to fully pick your partners in that region, but if their behavior changes, then re-examination on the of their designation would be due. But it's got to be based on not words, but behavior change. And John, I've not gotten the full brief from CENTCOM yet. I'll get, that was happened over the last couple of days, and I will get that in a classified brief later today. But the idea of keeping the most extreme Islamist groups at bay. We've got soldiers, 900 soldiers in Syria. We have been willing to push back against some of these are Sunni-backed groups often, not the Shia-backed groups that Iran has. But I don't have, I want to get the CENTCOM brief, but the idea that we have taken military strikes against al-Qaeda-related groups in that region for some time. And at this moment of instability, I want to hear the CENTCOM explanation, but to me, just at first glance, and it seems like appropriate to keep them at bay because these groups will see any effort to foster mischief or instability in the region. And unfortunately, whether it's been al-Qaeda in Iraq or some of these groups in Syria, the Iraqi people and the Syrian people pay the price for that. So I don't have a complaint at this point about what CENTCOM did, subject again to getting a full brief. But John, you ought to join this more often. Love to have you on these. I know certain things we agree, certain things we disagree, but I'd always like your questions.
Senator, that was our final question.
Thank you all so much, everybody.